Hello. In this video, I would like to give a quick introduction to the just war theory of St. Thomas Aquinas. But before we get to that, I'd like to give a little bit of a review of the context of just war theory within Christianity. It does have some roots outside of that, but a lot of it is taking place within the history of Christendom. So if we look back to Jesus, we know that Jesus practiced nonviolence himself in his own mission, but I would argue that he did not teach it as a universal ethic. But that's a whole can of worms we don't want to open right now. I just want to make the point that the life and teachings of Jesus are not simply a matter of teaching nonviolence. It's a little more complicated than that. In the early church, the response of early Christians to the ethical requirements of Christianity were mixed. There were Christians who served in the military, and there were those who were opposed to doing so. So people like Tertullian, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria opposed the idea that a Christian could serve in the military. But a lot of this was tied up with a rejection of the world in general. This was different from contemporary notions of pacifism or nonviolence. Now, Constantine comes along, and Constantine changes everything. Church and state now become connected. And whereas a government needs the power of the sword to protect itself and to protect its citizens, a universal ban on Christians serving in the military wasn't going to make it, especially when the commander-in-chief is a Christian. Well, sort of in the case of Constantine. So it wasn't long before Christians realized that they were going to have to address this issue head on. And it was St. Augustine of Hippo, that most excellent theologian, who laid out some rules and gave us the term just war theory in his massive work, The City of God, which he's holding up there. This was written in the early 5th century. Now, Augustine taught that love demands that we serve our neighbor. And sometimes that means using violence to stop the killing or enslavement of the innocent. And he wrote, "We do not seek peace in order to be at war, but we go to war that we may have peace. Be peaceful, therefore, in warring, so that you may vanquish those whom you war against and bring them to the prosperity of peace." Now, Augustine didn't give us a systematic treatment of the topic, but he gave us a good starting point. It was Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian and philosopher, who provided a more thorough accounting of the subject. This is found in his Summa Theologica. By the way, you can remember that Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century because there are 13 letters in his name, which was rather considerate of his parents. Okay, Thomas gave us the classical formulation for what would become the moral requirements for entering into a war, jus ad bellum in Latin. And according to him, there are 3 requirements: proper authority, just cause, and right intention. So let's look at the first one first. Proper authority. This is only for temporal authorities, right? Emperors, kings, princes, presidents who have the authority to declare and lead a war. Only they can declare war. No one else is permitted to do so. That means that religious leaders don't have the authority to do so, which means that Pope Urban II exceeded his authority in calling for the First Crusade. You can have just wars, but you can't have holy wars declared by religious leaders. Also, while we have the right to self-defense, we do not have the authority to take up arms against our fellow citizens or our own government. Now, that should give you something to think about as you try to make sense of the protests and counter-protests that have been happening in our country this year. Okay, the second requirement, just cause. This is the second requirement for a war to be just. The traditional interpretation of this requirement extended to 3 things: defense of the common good, recovery of something wrongfully taken, and punishment of evildoers. So a war to extend one's empire is not just. Engaging in a war to defend oneself against a hostile nation or to reclaim land wrongfully taken could be just. That whole punishment of evildoers thing is tricky, though. On the one hand, international force to stop a genocide within another nation's borders feels like a just cause. On the other, that language, punishment of evildoers, leaves us open to a whole lot more meddling in other nations' affairs. And the history of just war theory has been a long struggle to balance out what that means and whether that should be a requirement or is a sufficient justification or not. Okay, the third requirement, good intention. Thomas wrote, "Among true worshipers of God, those wars are looked on as peacemaking, which are waged neither from aggrandizement nor cruelty, but with the object of securing peace, of repressing evil and supporting the good." This also is tricky. On the one hand, we all probably agree with this as a requirement for a just war. Your intention must be virtuous, concerned with creating peace. On the other hand, it's really hard to measure someone's intention. People claim all sorts of things. And on the third hand, people do things for a multiplicity of reasons. A nation may go to war in order to assist an ally who is wrongfully attacked, with the honest goal of securing peace and justice, while at the same time being motivated by their desire to continue profitable trade in oil with that ally. How does one measure multiple intentions? Okay, so that is Thomas Aquinas's overview of just war theory. Now, some of you, if you know your just war theory, might be thinking, hey, what about jus in bello, right? What about all those rules for the conduct of war? What is forbidden, what is permitted? Well, most of that was going to have to wait a few centuries to get formulated and developed. Thomas didn't really give us that. You might also be thinking, what about the requirement that war must be a last resort? Isn't that part of just war theory? Well, that was added by some folks much later on, and it's not universally accepted. There are some real problems trying to figure out when you've reached the point of last resort. So, while Thomas didn't settle the issue for all time, he was tremendously helpful in starting a systematic treatment of this very important subject. And for that, we say, thank you, Thomas Aquinas. As for your appropriation of Aristotelian metaphysics for the doctrine of transubstantiation, well, that's another story.